Ava Robinson, a black woman, faces shocking racial discrimination from a pilot, but what happens next will leave you speechless. Imagine being denied a flight simply because of the color of your skin. Ava Robinson's story is not just about standing up to one man, it's about breaking the chains of systemic racism in an entire industry. When her husband, the airline owner, steps in, the pilot's career ends in an instant. But that's not the end of the story. Ava's powerful move sparks a revolution, inspiring a change in policies that ripples across the aviation world. Watch how one woman's courage to fight back reshapes an entire industry, proving that standing up for justice can lead to lasting, world-changing impact. Before we dive deeper into this gripping story, if you haven't subscribed to our channel, Epic Story Moments, yet, now is the perfect time. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update, and be the first to hear our incredible new stories. Don't forget to like, share, and comment to support more heartwarming tales like this. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. The terminal buzzed with the usual pre-flight tension, passengers hurrying through the busy space, their voices rising in a familiar hum. Flight 739 to Aspen was nearly ready for departure, and Ava Robinson, poised and confident, made her way toward the gate. The sharp sound of her heels echoed off the tiles as she approached the counter, her navy suit fitting her tall, elegant frame perfectly. Her polished leather handbag swayed slightly as she walked, and her scarf, a gift from her husband David, fluttered in the breeze. With a calm smile, she handed the gate agent her boarding pass. The young man behind the counter hesitated, his gaze flicking nervously between her and Captain Matthew Blake, who stood nearby. Blake, with his tall build and arrogant air, leaned against the counter, his eyes narrowing as they settled on Ava. "First class?" he asked, his voice unsure but still laced with something more. Ava's voice was steady. Yes. She had experienced this before, the sudden hesitation, the curious glance that always seemed to carry more than it showed. She remained composed, her expression unwavering. The agent scanned her ticket, about to wave her through when Blake stepped forward, placing a firm hand on the counter. "Excuse me," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Ma'am, are you sure you're at the right gate?" Ava turned to face him, her dark eyes locked onto his. "Quite sure," she replied, her voice calm but firm. Blake let out a laugh, the sound grating. "It's just unusual," he trailed off, his words heavy with an implication she knew all too well. "We don't often see first-class passengers, like you." Ava's lips tightened into a thin line, the weight of his words not lost on her. "Is there an issue with my ticket?" she asked, her tone cool, direct. Blake's eyes glinted with something darker than mere curiosity. "I'd just like to verify a few things before we allow you to board," he said, his voice laced with an underlying challenge. Ava stood tall, unfazed by his scrutiny. "You're the pilot, not security," she said. "Are ticket checks part of your duties?" Blake smirked, clearly relishing the small crowd that had gathered around them. "Let's just say I like to ensure everything runs smoothly on my flights," he said, his tone oozing false politeness. "Protocol, you know?" The murmurs of the other passengers grew louder. Some exchanged uneasy glances, others silently watched, unwilling to get involved. Ava could feel their eyes on her, the weight of their silence pressing down, but she refused to shrink. "If there's a problem," she said, her voice cutting through the noise, "I'd like to know what it is. Otherwise, I'd appreciate it if you let me board." Blake's smirk faltered, but he didn't back down. "Security concerns," he muttered. "We've had some incidents lately. You understand, I'm sure." Ava's jaw tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. Instead of engaging further, she reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and dialed David's number. "I need you at gate 14 now," she said, her voice steady but firm. Blake's smile returned, smug and confident. "Oh, by all means," he sneered. "But I'm afraid no phone call is going to change the rules." Ava didn't flinch. She simply returned her phone to her bag and stepped aside, unbroken. "I'll wait," she said calmly. The tension at the gate was palpable as the minutes ticked by. Passengers whispered, their curiosity piqued by the drama unfolding before them. Ava remained composed, her gaze fixed on the terminal entrance. When David Robinson arrived, the air seemed to shift. Tall and commanding, dressed in a sharp suit, David moved with purpose. His presence was enough to part the crowd as he made his way toward the gate, his eyes locking onto Captain Blake's. The quiet murmur of the crowd faded to a hush as David's presence commanded attention. There was a subtle recognition that passed through the passengers. Whether they knew exactly who he was or not, his confidence and authority were undeniable. David's gaze found Ava immediately. She stood tall, calm, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the subtle tightness in her jaw, and the way she gripped her handbag. He felt a surge of anger, not at her, but at the man who had dared to challenge her dignity. Ava stepped forward as David approached. "David," she said, her voice steady, but with a trace of relief. She knew he would come, he always did. His presence now felt like a fortress between her and the injustice she faced. David turned his gaze to Captain Blake, who still stood with a smug expression. Blake didn't recognize him yet, but the subtle disdain in his posture showed he didn't see David as a threat. That assumption was about to change. David turned to the gate agent first, his voice calm but commanding. "I'd like an explanation as to why my wife is being prevented from boarding her flight." The young agent stammered, nervously glancing at Blake for guidance. Blake stepped forward, his confidence unwavering. "I'm ensuring the safety of my passengers," he said smoothly. "Your wife raised some concerns?" David's brow furrowed, his tone sharpening. "Concerns? What concerns?" "She presented a valid ticket, didn't she?" Blake hesitated, a brief moment of uncertainty crossing his face. "Well, yes," he admitted. "But I have the authority to make decisions regarding passenger safety." David's voice dropped, each word cutting with precision. "And what exactly about my wife makes her a safety concern?" Blake's smugness wavered, but he quickly recovered, offering a patronizing smile. "I don't have to justify my decisions to you." David stepped closer, his presence towering. "You do now." The crowd held its breath. The tension was unbearable as the two men stood facing each other, one commanding respect, the other arrogance. "Here's the rewritten version of your text." David's gaze was unwavering as Blake, visibly irritated by the challenge, folded his arms. "Who exactly do you think you are to demand an explanation?" Blake sneered. David's response was calm, but his voice carried an undeniable authority. "David Robinson," he said evenly, "owner of this airline." The room froze. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and the gate agent's face drained of color. Blake's confident smirk vanished, replaced by stunned silence. His mouth opened to speak, but no words came out. David didn't give him the chance to recover. "Your actions today have not only humiliated my wife, but have jeopardized the integrity of this company," he said. "I demand a full explanation right now." Blake's arrogance faltered, and he stammered, I was just following protocol." His voice wavered, and even he could tell how hollow the excuse sounded. David's voice cut through the air with precision. "Don't insult my intelligence by hiding behind protocol. This is about prejudice, plain and simple, and it ends here." Blake's face flushed red as his bravado crumbled. "I was only—" David interrupted, his tone sharp. "Trying to what? Assert your superiority over a paying passenger? Over my wife? I won't tolerate this." Ava, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. Her voice was calm, but there was a weight behind it that silenced Blake's weak protests. "I've dealt with men like you before, Captain," she said. "You think your position entitles you to treat people however you please. But today, you've crossed the wrong line." Blake faltered, his confidence eroding further. "It's a misunderstanding," he mumbled, his voice trembling. David's gaze turned icy. "The only misunderstanding here is your assumption that your behavior would go unchecked. Security will escort you off this flight. Consider this your last day in uniform." Gasps and murmurs broke out among the passengers as Blake's face contorted in disbelief. "You can't be serious," he sputtered. "I've been with this airline for over 10 years." David's voice was calm, but there was a finality to it. Your tenure ends today. Moments later, security arrived, summoned by the gate staff, who now stood rigid with fear. Officers approached Blake, who began protesting vehemently, but David raised his hand. Escort him off the premises, David instructed. Ensure his access credentials are revoked immediately. The security officers nodded, their movements efficient and unemotional. Blake's protests grew louder as they led him away, his voice fading into the distance. The passengers, silent and stunned by the scene, broke into scattered applause. David turned back to Ava, his expression softening. "Are you all right?" he asked in a low voice meant only for her. Ava gave him a small smile, her composure unbroken. "I am now." David nodded and addressed the gate agent. "Make sure my wife boards first, and provide her with every courtesy." The young man nodded hastily, trembling as he scanned Ava's boarding pass. "Right away, Mr. Robinson, Mrs. Robinson. Please this way." As Ava walked toward the boarding tunnel, David lingered, ensuring everything was handled properly. His gaze swept over the remaining staff and passengers, silently daring anyone to question the events that had unfolded. Then, without a word, he turned and followed his wife onto the plane. The plush leather of the first-class seat offered a comforting reprieve, but Ava's mind remained restless. She adjusted the silk scarf around her neck and leaned back slightly, her gaze fixed on the cabin window. Beyond the glass, the runway stretched endlessly under the golden glow of the setting sun, an image of tranquility at odds with a storm that had just unfolded. The faint sound of footsteps drew her attention. A flight attendant approached, her expression apologetic, her hands clasped nervously. "Mrs. Robinson," the attendant began, her voice tinged with both respect and unease. "On behalf of the crew, I want to deeply apologize for the treatment you experienced earlier. It was unacceptable." Ava turned her gaze toward the woman, her expression unreadable. "Thank you," she said simply, her tone cool but not unkind. She didn't feel the need to say more. The weight of the earlier humiliation still hung heavy in the air. The attendant nodded quickly and backed away. Moments later, David slid into the seat beside her. His movements were purposeful, but quieter than usual. His face, usually composed, carried a trace of tension, a reminder of how the day had spiraled out of control. "Are you okay?" he asked, breaking the silence. His voice was low, almost hesitant, as if he feared the answer. Ava glanced at him, a faint smile curving her lips. "I am," she replied. "But you look like you're not." David sighed, running a hand through his neatly styled hair. "I can't help thinking about how many others he might have treated that way," he admitted. "How many people didn't have someone to step in for them?" Ava nodded, her expression softening. "It's not the first time I've dealt with someone like Captain Blake. I doubt it will be the last. But today felt different." David leaned closer, his brow furrowing. "How so?" Ava turned back to the window, her voice quieter now. "It wasn't just his words, David. It was the way he looked at me, as though I didn't belong. As though I was trespassing in a space that could never be mine, no matter how much I've earned it." David's jaw tightened. He hated the idea of her enduring such moments, and the realization that they had happened far more often than she let on only deepened his anger. "I should have been here sooner," he said. "I should have." Ava's voice was firm, cutting through his self-recrimination. She reached over and placed her hand on his. "You were there when it mattered. That's what counts." The warmth of her touch grounded him, and he exhaled slowly, nodding. "You're right," he admitted. "But I won't let this slide. Blake's behavior isn't just about you. It's about the culture he thought would protect him." Ava's gaze met his, her dark eyes steady and thoughtful. "Then let's change it," she said. "Not just for me, but for everyone who's been in my shoes." David smiled faintly, a glimmer of pride lighting his features. "We will," he promised. "Starting with a complete overhaul of the airline's policies, and I want you to lead it." Ava blinked, caught off guard. "Me?" David nodded. "No one understands the stakes better than you. You've lived this. You can help ensure no one else has to." For a moment, Ava said nothing. Her mind raced through the implications of his words, then slowly, she nodded. If it means making a difference, I'll do it. David squeezed her hand gently. You always do. The sound of the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their imminent takeoff. Ava and David settled into their seats as the engines roared to life. The plane hurtled down the runway and lifted into the air. As the cabin lights dimmed and the world below grew smaller, Ava closed her eyes, letting the hum of the engines soothe her frayed nerves. For the first time that day, she allowed herself a moment of peace, knowing that change was already in motion. But as the plane soared higher, one thought lingered in her mind. Captain Blake might be gone, but the fight for equality was far from over. And she was ready to lead it. The morning after their flight, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of David and Ava Robinson's penthouse apartment. The city skyline glimmered in the distance, but neither of them was in the mood to enjoy the view. Ava sat at the kitchen island, her laptop open and a fresh cup of coffee in her hand. She was reviewing an email from David's legal team detailing the official termination of Captain Matthew Blake. The language was precise and damning, a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination and an immediate dismissal for violating company ethics. David entered the room, tying his cufflinks as he prepared for another day of meetings. He paused, noting the tension in Ava's posture. Are you still thinking about yesterday? He asked, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Ava glanced up, her expression thoughtful. It's not just about yesterday, she admitted. It's about everything it represents. Captain Blake wasn't the problem. He was a symptom of something much bigger. David nodded, leaning against the counter. You're right. That's why we're going to address it. Not just for him, but for everyone. Ava nodded slightly, her gaze distant as she relived the incident in her mind. I had to make sure he knew it wasn't just about this one moment. It's about setting a standard, showing that we won't tolerate this behavior anymore. David's expression softened, the weight of the day resting on both of their shoulders. I'm proud of you. You're not just handling these situations, you're changing the way things are done. People are starting to notice. Ava let out a small sigh, her fingers brushing the rim of her glass. It's not enough to notice, though. It's about taking real action. If we don't keep pushing, it'll all be for nothing. David leaned in closer, his voice low and sincere. You're right, and I'll be right beside you, every step of the way. Ava gave him a tired smile, grateful for his support. We're just getting started, she said, her resolve as strong as ever. The next few weeks brought a series of challenges as Ava and her team worked tirelessly to implement the new policies and programs. The airline's atmosphere slowly shifted, but the true test of their efforts came when a group of employees voiced concerns about the diversity training programs. Some felt the initiatives were too forceful, too quick. Others worried that they might be unfairly singled out. Ava knew that changing a culture wasn't easy, especially one that had been entrenched for so long. She addressed the concerns head-on, holding open forums where employees could voice their opinions without fear of reprisal. During one of these meetings, a senior flight attendant stood up, her face flushed with frustration. I don't understand why this is necessary, the woman said, her voice trembling. We've been working together for years. Why now? Ava's gaze remained steady as she responded, her voice calm but firm. Because for years, we've allowed issues to go unaddressed. It's time for all of us, myself included, to confront the uncomfortable truths and work together to create a better, more inclusive environment. The room fell silent, but the flight attendant's expression softened as she considered Ava's words. Slowly, others in the room began to nod in agreement, and the atmosphere shifted once more, this time toward understanding. By the end of the month, the company had rolled out a revised set of employee guidelines, and the anonymous reporting system had been fully integrated. Ava watched as the changes took root, and she could see that people were starting to feel empowered to speak up, to take ownership of the culture they were helping to build. One afternoon, as Ava and David were walking through the airport, she received a call from one of her team leaders. There had been another incident, this time involving a passenger who had been subjected to offensive remarks from a crew member. Her stomach tightened as she listened to the details, but she remained composed. I'll handle it, she said, her voice resolute. David squeezed her hand, offering silent support. "You've got this." When they arrived at the scene, Ava was once again faced with a tense situation. The passenger, a young woman in her 20s, was visibly upset, her arms crossed as she stood at the counter. The crew member in question stood awkwardly to the side, her eyes lowered in shame. Ava addressed the passenger first, her voice soft but firm. "I want to personally apologize for what you've experienced. This behavior is completely unacceptable, and we are addressing it immediately." The young woman nodded, her voice still shaky as she spoke. "I've flown with your airline for years. I never expected this kind of treatment." "I understand," Ava said, her tone sincere. "We're committed to making sure this doesn't happen again. You'll be fully compensated for your experience, and we'll ensure that this matter is handled appropriately." Turning to the crew member, Ava's gaze was unyielding. "I've reviewed your actions, and I'm afraid you will be suspended pending a full investigation. You will also be required to undergo additional training before returning to work." The crew member's face paled, but she nodded in understanding. Ava gestured for a supervisor to escort the young woman to her seat, ensuring she was taken care of. As the situation was resolved, Ava's mind was already racing with the next steps. Once the incident was behind them, she and David sat down in their office, the weight of the day slowly lifting. David looked at her with admiration. "You handled that perfectly." Ava smiled, but there was a quiet determination in her eyes. "It's not about handling it perfectly, David. It's about making sure the change sticks. We have a long way to go, and I won't stop until we've made this airline a place where everyone feels safe, valued, and respected." David's expression softened, pride swelling in his chest. "You're making a difference. And I'm with you every step of the way." Ava nodded, knowing that their fight for equality was far from over. But she was ready. Together, they would ensure that no one else would have to endure what she had, and the culture at the airline would be reshaped, one step at a time. Ava sat in her new office, reviewing notes when David walked in. He leaned against the door, watching her closely. "You didn't hold back," he remarked. Ava looked up with a faint smile. "I didn't have to. If they're serious about change, they'll rise to the occasion." David stepped in, taking a seat across from her. "Remarkable. You know that." Ava raised an eyebrow. "Flattery won't get you out of taking me to dinner tonight." David chuckled. "It wasn't flattery. Watching you today reminded me why I fell in love with you." Ava leaned back, her expression softening. "And what's that?" David's voice softened. "You don't just see problems. You solve them with grace and strength." Ava smiled, reaching across the desk to take his hand. "I wouldn't be able to do it without your support." David squeezed her hand gently. "You don't need me for this, but I'll always back you up." Ava nodded, her resolve strengthening. Together, they were ready to reshape not just the airline, but the industry itself. A month into Ava's initiative, the airline was already seeing shifts. Policies were being rewritten, training sessions were happening, and the anonymous reporting system was in place. Ava knew, though, that the true test would come during moments of crisis. It came one crisp morning when Ava received an urgent call. A security camera showed a black man, Mr. Carter, being stopped at gate 27 by a gate agent, Claire, who was questioning his ticket. Ava felt a pang of familiarity with the situation but quickly pushed it aside. She had to act. She arrived at the gate, security following her closely. Claire stood frozen when she saw Ava. "What's going on here?" Ava asked. Claire stammered, explaining that she thought Mr. Carter's ticket was fraudulent. Ava's gaze was firm. What exactly about this man's ticket or appearance seemed suspicious? Mr. Carter stepped forward, frustration clear. "I've flown with this airline for years without issue, but today I'm treated like a criminal." Ava turned back to Claire. "You humiliated him in front of others because of your assumptions. That's exactly what we're trying to eliminate." Ava immediately directed Mr. Carter to first class and turned back to Claire. "Unconscious bias influences decisions. That's why we've implemented this training." Ava was firm but compassionate. "You'll be suspended pending an investigation." Later that evening, Ava recounted the day to David. "You handled it perfectly," he said. Ava leaned back, weary but resolute. It's progress, but a reminder of how much further we have to go. David squeezed her hand. You're making a difference every day. The next week, Ava presented her efforts to the board. Tensions ran high, but Ava stood firm, addressing the resistance to change. Complacency isn't an option, she said. Every day we delay, more people suffer. The room fell silent. Julia, one of the board members, spoke up. I think Mrs. Robinson makes an excellent point. We can't afford to stay stagnant. After the meeting, David joined her in her office. You handled that well, he said. Even Richard didn't know how to respond. Ava sighed. Convincing people that equality isn't a luxury, but a necessity is exhausting. David placed a hand on her shoulder. But you're changing minds. That's harder, but it's more impactful. Later, Ava received a call from Mr. Carter, the passenger from gate 27. I just wanted to thank you, he said. I've never seen an airline take these issues so seriously. Ava felt a lump in her throat. Thank you, Mr. Carter. That means more than you know. Ava's initiative was rippling through the airline industry. Articles praised her efforts, and employees were feeling empowered to speak up. Ava was invited to speak at a global aviation summit, where her address was met with a standing ovation. Afterward, leaders from other airlines sought her advice on implementing similar programs. Ava's success didn't stop with the airline. She was invited to join a federal task force aimed at combating discrimination across all transportation industries. David, supportive as always, encouraged her to take the position. Meanwhile, Captain Matthew Blake, the pilot who had discriminated against Ava, faced public backlash and legal trouble. His wrongful termination lawsuit against the airline became a symbol of accountability in corporate spaces. Ava testified in the trial, emphasizing that this was not just about one man losing his job, but about creating a culture where discrimination had no place. As the case unfolded, Ava's vision continued to inspire others, proving that lasting change was possible, no matter how difficult the fight. The court ruling in favor of the airline was a resounding victory for Ava, validating everything she had fought for. Captain Blake's wrongful termination case was dismissed, and with it, a powerful message was sent. Discrimination would no longer be tolerated. The ruling not only vindicated Ava, but also sent a clear signal to anyone who still clung to outdated practices. This was a turning point, and Ava's vision for change was becoming a reality. In the months that followed, Ava's work brought her closer to David in ways they hadn't expected. Their shared mission had become a cornerstone of their marriage, and late nights spent discussing ideas, reflecting on their journey, and strategizing for the future became part of their routine. One evening, as they celebrated the first anniversary of Ava's initiative, David raised his glass to his wife. To my wife, he said, his voice filled with pride, for proving that change is not only possible, but inevitable. Ava smiled, the weight of the past year lifting slightly. She raised her glass. And to you, she replied, her gratitude evident, for standing by me every step of the way. Years later, Ava's work was recognized as a pivotal moment in the airline industry. The policies she had fought for and implemented became standard practice across the industry, setting a new benchmark for inclusivity and equality. Her leadership had inspired a new generation of women and minorities to pursue careers in aviation. The company's training program, now named the Robinson Initiative in her honor, became a symbol of empowerment. As Ava stood beside David, watching the new class of employees graduate from the program, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She thought back to the moment that had sparked this entire journey, the humiliating encounter at Gate 27. What had been designed to break her had become the catalyst for a sweeping wave of change, not just for her but for countless others. As the applause echoed through the room, Ava realized that the fight for equality was far from over. The challenges had not disappeared, and many battles still lay ahead. But she was no longer fighting alone, and the seeds she had planted were now beginning to grow. Her vision had become a movement, one that would continue to evolve and shape the future. This was not just her victory, it was a legacy, a promise to future generations that the fight for justice and equality would never cease.